Hello everyone. In this video, I am going to talk about the recently published book, Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment. That's the full title of the book. Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment. The book is written by Daniel Kahneman, Olivier Sibony, and Sunstein. Let me begin with a general note about the task of the book. What is this book trying to accomplish? And what does it happen when we read it? There are some books that inform us about some concepts we already know. So imagine reading a book about drinking water. So we already know what drinking water is. It is not a new concept that is being introduced to us. But we can still be informed in that kind of book about the history of drinking water, technology, some historical facts and geographical facts related to drinking water, distribution of drinking water. Those books are, relatively speaking, informative, but they don't introduce new ways of thinking for the most part. Another type of book introduces us to new concepts and, as a consequence, to new ways of thinking. The examples that come to my mind, are books by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the concept black swan or the concept of anti-fragile. So once you are introduced to these concepts, you're introduced to new ways of thinking about familiar topics, previously familiar topics like prediction. But after knowing about black swan, or the way Taleb introduces us to the notion of black swan or the notion of anti-fragile, then we won't think the same way about prediction after that, about mathematical models, about risk-taking, and even about academia and academic contributions. So I talked about those two styles of writing, those two types of books, one that gives us information about known concepts and another type of book that introduces us to new concepts. To place this book, Noise, at a place in between those two types of books, because the concept noise is not completely new to us. If I say the book is about noise, you already have some understanding, you already have a working concept, a working definition of this word noise. But at the same time, the authors are encouraging us, inviting us to think in new ways with the help of this concept noise. And they are trying to enrich our definition, enrich our understanding of this notion of noise and its application to various domains related to human judgment and human decision making. And one of the main things that they want to do is that they want to tell us that in some situations, at least in some situations, we should replace the concept of bias with the concept noise. So now let's get into that distinction. The difference between bias on the one hand and noise. What is the difference between them, and why is it useful for us to sometimes replace bias with noise, to work and think with noise instead of with bias? So let's begin with bias. When we have biases in decision making, bias based on race, age, gender, these biases are usually directional. They have a direction. A bias, for example, could be in favor of a race or some races and against some other races. So there's the directionality to bias. There is a system or predictability. Biases tend to be systematic, and they tend to have known or knowable causes. And these causes are shared by people, at least by a group of people. And understanding the causes behind bias can help us overcome and eliminate, at least combat, bias. So we cannot remove a bias usually without first understanding what bias is. Now, with that review of bias, let's now move to noise. In contrast to bias, noise is not directional. So everybody is noisy in a different direction. And a noisy decision or a noisy judgment in a group of people, if you find that a group of people are noisy with respect to a judgment, it means that each person might have their own individual bias. And when we look at them as a group in terms of a system or an organization, what we see is noise, because the deviations are not systematic, they're not predictable. They're disorganized, and they produce disorganization. And there may not be a clear reason or no known reason. And the point here is that the authors argue that we don't even need to know in many occasions, we don't even need to know the reason behind a noisy system to remove it. And the analogy that they use is the analogy of hygiene and washing our hands. When you wash your hand, you don't need to know the exact types of germs and how many types of germs you're removing as you're washing your hands with soap. Nevertheless, your act of washing your hand is removing germs. And they say, the authors, Kahneman and colleagues, they argue that noise is kind of like germs in that sense. There are things that we can implement in our decision making, in our judgment, that remove noise even without requiring that we understand what is causing the noise. Now, with that distinction between bias and noise, now let's get to the definition, the author's definition of noise. They define it very simply. They say noise is variability that is undesirable. So undesirable variability in places where there shouldn't be variability is noise. The book begins with another analogy of shooting at a target. So imagine you're in a group of people and each person throws a dart or shoots an arrow or shoots a bullet at targets. If the entire group, their shots or their responses, if all the shots are away from the target in one direction, let's say they're all shifted towards the left, that's bias. But if all the shots are scattered around the center of the target, that is noise. So scattered around the center, some center is noise, and shift in a systematic and organized way, shift away from the target, from the correct decision, that is bias. The assumption here is that there is an objective center. There's an objective center of the target being the correct answer, the correct judgment, the correct decision. And that is an important assumption, especially when it comes to the human domain, the human social domain, because a lot of what we have as parts of our social life are the results of convention, culture, convention, agreement, and negotiation. That means that there are some cases for decision making, there's some places where we are required to make a judgment, and we are encountering genuinely new a phenomenon for the first time. So we have to first begin with disagreements. Maybe we should first extend the domain of the social life has to extend itself to include that new phenomenon. Let's say a new crime, a type of crime that has happened for the first time in human history, or a criminal case that is, at least in a significant way, unique. So judges or juries have to negotiate, have to begin with disagreement, and their disagreement shouldn't be called noise. And maybe different judges or different courts encounter very similar cases and they arrive at different conclusions. According to the authors, that would be a noise in their disagreements should be characterized as noise. But we could also characterize that kind of disagreements as the recognition that phenomenon is not yet incorporated into the human domain in a way that is easily identifiable and easily available for judgment and decision making. We could also say that sometimes the human social world is genuinely, it includes variability, it includes variation. We can say that disagreements are a real part of our lives, a real part of the human social world. Is that a reasonable assumption to have? If it is, then that would be against the position of the authors here. The examples that they use, Kahneman and co-authors, the two major kinds of examples they use are, as I said, the criminal court cases, the decisions made by judges, and the fact that sometimes different judges facing almost identical cases make very different decisions, and that is undesirable. And they also use other examples. Of one of them, one main one is insurance companies and insurance company agents that offer premiums, and different agents facing the same situation, same client, might offer very different premiums, and that variability results in the loss of money for the company. The good point, of course, there's a point at the heart of the author's argument here, the heart of this book, that is really good. And that is, sometimes people, especially people in a position of power, make decisions that are not backed by responsibility. So there's an absence of responsibility sometimes when we make decisions. So they're encouraging us to be more responsible, to examine our decisions, the basis of our decisions more carefully, and be more rigorous in our judgments. So rigor, responsibility, these are really good things, and they work against noise. They offer a variety of diagnoses and tools for diagnosis, for removing noise. One of my favorite, was something that also allows us to dissociate the so-called wisdom of the crowd. So when a crowd of people make judgments and together as a collective, they are very accurate. If you average their responses, if you average their judgments, they're very accurate. So that is known as the wisdom of the crowd. And dissociate that from the madness of the crowd. So when an incorrect judgment, a bias, an initial bias becomes stronger and stronger, and people together deviate very wildly from the correct and reasonable judgment. So when is it that sometimes we have wisdom of the crowd and sometimes we have madness of the crowd? In short, you can read the book to get to know the author's analysis. But in short, it has to do with access to each other's judgments. When we know about the judgments of other people, we tend to blend in, try to join in their judgment and not think, to outsource our thinking and let the crowd think for us. But if the crowd consists of people who have thought in advance, who have considered their decisions in advance, and then they join together to share their judgments, to talk about why they decided the way they decided, after they have already made their judgments as individuals, then we get something like the wisdom of the crowd. The authors continually assume that there are correct decisions in the domains that they argue, and that our job should be to find these correct decisions, or at least even if we don't know the correct decisions, we should try to minimize variability. And minimizing variability sometimes requires putting in place regulations, rules and regulations, so everybody follows the same steps in making a decision. And as a result, decisions in a group look the same. We have similar outcomes. Another distinction that I really liked is a distinction between true expertise and respect expertise. A lot of times when there's an organized body of existing experts that give recognition to new members of their community, there's a big risk of having respect expertise instead of genuine expertise. That is, genuine expertise is in contact with reality. Respect expertise is only in contact with convention. So it is grounds for noise. It gives rise to noise and noisy decisions, and a lot of confidence that is not backed by knowledge and experience and previous practice. Another thing that I really liked about the book is that towards the end, in the last couple of chapters in the book, the authors consider the critiques of their position. The position being that undesirable variability or noise should be removed, and we should do our best to remove undesirable variability or noise. They consider six or so criticisms, possible criticisms, or previously expressed criticisms of their position. And I loved that part because it made their presentation much more complete and much more balanced. It doesn't matter that at the end they eventually dismiss these criticisms one by one, but the way they present the critiques, the alternative views that say we should not mindlessly reduce variability, that noise is not always a bad thing. The way they presented those alternative positions, the positions of their adversary, was really good. It was really well done. And it made the book, for me, much more enjoyable to read. And you can read those criticisms, those alternative positions, and you can take them in your own thinking and extend the book in a way that was not necessarily done by the authors. So the way the authors include those alternative perspectives, those opposing perspectives in their presentation, allows the reader to extend their reading experience in their own particular way, which is really great. To me, I think the most clear application of a book like this is in the financial sector. That might be just my own bias, but I think that in the financial sector, in places like an insurance company, it is there that we can most easily and most clearly talk about noise, identify noise, call variability and disagreement as noise, because we can see how a noisy judgment or a noisy set of judgments are costing money for the company. In other places, I don't think it is as easy, as straightforward. Even in the medical domain, in the medical fields, I don't think it is as straightforward to identify variability as noise, because people might selectively pay attention to different aspects of what they're observing and have variability and disagreement that reflects something genuine that is not easily identifiable as noise. I think that's all I had to say. If you have more thoughts, if you have read the book, or if you like to read the book, I would like to hear your ideas and your thoughts. If you like to support my channel, the best way is to go through Patreon. We have a reading group. At the moment, we are reading some texts by Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst, and we will switch to different texts in the future. You will also find there the option of studying with me, going through a book like this one, like Noise, in a relatively slow way, chapter by chapter, if you are interested in doing that. Otherwise, I hope you're all well, and until next time.